Welcome to the presentation on changes in school funding and local funding formula for 24-25. The presentation is being recorded and it'll be uploaded to our YouTube channel. The Schools Operation Guide is there to help local authorities and schools forums plan and implement funding for the 24-25 financial year. National Funding Formula, or NFF, which we'll refer to during the presentation. During the presentation today, we'll cover the summary of the changes to 24-25 NFF. This includes schools, high needs, central school services block and early years. We'll also look at the implications for the 24-25 local formulae as set out in the Schools Operational Guide. So for the summary of the changes to 24-25 National Funding Formulae, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Ellie.
Thanks, Helen. So in the National Funding Formula for 24-25, the school section, funding is increasing by 1.9% per pupil compared to 23-24. And taken together with the funding increases seen in 23-24, this means that through the school's NFF, there will be a 7.6% higher per pupil rate in 24-25 compared to 22-23. And it's worth noting that this doesn't include the funding that has been allocated through the Teachers Pay Additional Grant, which will be on top of the NFF in both 23-24 and 24-25. So the particular factor values that have increased are as follows. So there's been a 1.4% increase to the basic entitlement, low prior attainment, free school meals ever 6, income deprivation affecting children index or IDACI factor, English as an additional language, mobility, sparsity, the lump sum and the minimum per pupil level. So they've all been increased by 1.4%. The free school meal factor that pays for the meals has been increased by 1.6%, as always in line with the GDP deflator. And the floor has been raised by 0.5%. There's been 0% increase on the premises factors, except for the PFI factor, which has been increased by the RPI index. And also it's worth noting, we'll come on to this, but split sites funding has been formularised, and we'll explain a bit more about that. So the first key change to point out in the 24-25 NFF is that the mainstream schools additional grant has been rolled in. So this was paid separately in 23-24 and now it's being rolled into the school's NFF. And the methodology used to roll in the grant has been done to ensure that the additional funding that schools will now attract through the NFF is as close as possible to the funding that they would have received if the funding was still in a separate grant. So this was done by adding an amount representing what schools receive through the grant into their baselines, adding the value of the lump sum per pupil, basic per pupil rates and free school meal ever 6 FM6 parts of the grant into the respective factors in the NFF, and also uplifting the minimum per pupil values by the average amount of funding schools currently funded through the minimum levels received through the grant. Then it's also worth noting that the increases on the previous slide are increases on top of the additional funding provided through the above factors through rolling in MSAG, the additional grant. And also to say that the tightened allowable factor values in the local formulae also include the MSAG funding. So as I said in 24-25, a key change is that we are formularising the split sites funding. So the split sites factor is to target extra funding to schools which operate across more than one site. And so from 24-25, we have a formulaic approach to allocating this funding. And this is replacing the previously locally determined split sites factor used by some local authorities. So through this factor, schools will attract a lump sum, and that's £53,700 plus the area cost adjustment. For each of their additional eligible sites, and that's up to a maximum of 3 additional sites. Also, schools whose sites are separated by more than 100 metres attract distance funding, and this distance funding varies depending on how far apart the sites are, and is up to a maximum of £26,900, again with the area cost adjustment on top, for sites which are at least 500 metres away. That's the maximum distance. The NFF funding is for any school losing out from the formalisation of the split sites factor will be protected through the floor. So any school losing funding would be protected through the floor. Okay. A further change to the school's NFF is that from 24-25, we will allocate funding to local authorities on the basis of falling roles as well as growth. So falling roles funding will be distributed on the basis of the reduction in pupil numbers that local authorities experience for each year. And it's based on the observed differences between the primary and secondary number on roll in each local authority between the most recent October pupil census and the census in the previous October. And there's a calculator tool available to support local authorities to understand how the formula will work, and that was published in August. And the final allocations for this will be announced in December. So as we did in 23-24, we are in 24-25 expecting local formulae to be brought closer to the NFF through our tightening requirements. And so, as it was the case last year, all factors in the NFF are compulsory in local formulae. So local authorities must now use the formulaic split sites factor that I just described. And the factor values for this must be set within the plus or minus 2.5%, the mirroring threshold. For the other factors, local authorities are required to bring their local formulae factors 10% closer to the NFF, as was the case last year. So compared to the difference between the local formula factor value and the NFF factor value in 23-24. So local factor values that are within the 2.5% of the NFF values, plus or minus 2.5%, are deemed to be mirroring the NFF. So local authorities with factors that mirror the NFF can set those factor values within the plus or minus 2.5% of the NFF values. And no local authority is required to move their factor values closer to the NFF than that mirroring requirement, the 2.5%, despite the 10% tightening requirement. And local authorities can't overshoot the NFF value. So in their movement towards the NFF, they mustn't overshoot beyond that mirroring threshold. So for example, a local authority which had a given local factor value above the NFF value in 23-24 can't move to being more than 2.5% below the NFF factor value. Geographic costs are accounted for within tightening, and that's through applying the area cost adjustment to each NFF value, ensuring each tightened value is adjusted by the authority's area cost adjustment. And for London Fringe local authorities that have 2 ACAs, the tightening criteria applies in respect of the lower ACA, and all of those allowable factor values are available online through the link in the presentation. So from 24-25, we are expecting local authorities to provide growth funding, and the requirements for this are set out in our policy document. So where a school or academy has agreed with the local authority to provide an extra class in order to meet basic need in the area, either as a bulge class or an ongoing commitment, there's a minimum amount of funding that must be provided. So local authorities must provide funding at least that calculated through using this formula. So the primary growth factor value, which is £1,550, multiplied by the number of pupils, multiplied by the area cost adjustment. And local authorities with a falling roles fund must also follow the new requirements for falling roles funding, and that is that local authorities can only provide falling roles funding to schools where the School Capacity Survey 2022 data shows that school places will be required in the next 3 to 5 years. Previously, there was a restriction that the schools had to be judged good or outstanding by Ofsted, but this requirement has been removed from 24-25. I'm going to pass back to Hilla for this section.
So the key changes to the high needs NFF. The structure of the high needs NFF is remain largely unchanged in 24-25. The 24-25 high needs NFF include a 3% funding floor to make sure that all local authorities receive an increase of at least 3% per head of their 2 to 18 population compared to their 23-24 funding baseline. This is lower than the minimum funding increases in the above 2 years of this 3-year spending review period because the 2021 spending review settlement was front-loaded. We're also given an additional £400 million to allocate for this and the next financial year at the time of the 2022 autumn settlement. This extra £400 million allocated this year has been included in the 23-24 baseline for the 24-25 NFF. Gains under the high needs NFF in 24-25 will be limited to 5%. This gains limit has allowed us to provide more local authorities with a greater and above average increases than would have been possible with a higher limit on the gains. We have issued guidance to help local authorities review the calculation of their mainstream schools' notional percent budgets, and this will be covered later in the workshop.
So the key changes to the Central Schools Services Block, or the CSSB. The CSSB provides money for local authorities to carry out central functions on behalf of maintained schools and academies, comprising of ongoing responsibilities and historic commitments. So the total funding for ongoing responsibilities for 24-25 is £304 million, and this includes an additional £5.5 million to cover the exceptional increase in copyright licences in 23-24 as licences were updated following the increased use of digital technology. Local authorities will be protected, so the maximum per pupil year-on-year reduction in ongoing responsibilities funding is minus 2.5%, and there's a gains cap of 5.51%. And as in recent years, historic commitments funding has again been reduced by 20%. And the department has protected local authorities from having a reduction that takes their historic commitments funding below the total value of prudential borrowing and termination of employment costs in recognition of the time required for costs to unwind.
On the 21st of July, the DfE announced a consultation on our approach to distributing entitlements funding for 2-year-olds and under from 24-25 in light of the introduction of the new entitlements for working parents with children aged 9 months to 2 years. With the introduction of the new entitlements for working parents with children aged 9 months to 2 years, it's important that the funding system in place supports the delivery of these entitlements and ensures that we continue to distribute funding fairly and efficiently to local authorities across England. As the new entitlements are for a new age group and for 2-year-olds for a new cohort of families, we're proposing to introduce a new funding formula to calculate local authority hourly funding rates for 2-year-olds and under. We're also proposing to extend eligibility for the early years pupil premium and the Disability Access Fund to all eligible children accessing the entitlements from April 2024. This will ensure that we continue to support children from disadvantaged backgrounds. The consultation also sets out proposals for the local funding framework within which authorities will be expected to pass the money on to providers. This is intended to give authorities the support and flexibility they need to support the delivery of the childcare offers whilst ensuring the great majority of funding reaches providers in a fair and transparent way. Alongside the consultation, we published modelling which sets out illustrative local authority hourly funding rates for 2-year-olds and for 2-year-olds and under for 24-25. As there's no changes to entitlements for 3 and 4-year-olds, we will not be making any changes to the existing 3 and 4-year-olds formula, aside from the regular updates to the underlying data. The consultation ran until 8th of September 2023, and we'll publish the government response to this and the final rates for 24-25 for all of the early years funding streams as soon as possible in the autumn. We're now going to move to part 2 of the presentation, which looks at the implications for the 24-25 local funding formula as set out in the school's operational guide. Basic entitlement. This is a compulsory factor and the values must be brought 10% closer to the NFF values, subject to the 2.5% mirroring threshold. It's based on pupils' numbers from reception to year 11 as per the October census. Funding is allocated according to a basic per pupil rate. There's a single rate for primary, but there can be different rates for Key Stage 3 and Key Stage 4. The rolled-in basic entitlement of the element of the supplementary amount should be added to basic per pupil rates. Local authorities can choose to increase the pupil number count for schools with higher reception pupil numbers in the January 2024 census rather than the October 2023 census. However, what local authorities should bear in mind that this flexibility will be removed from 2025 to 2026. Minimum per pupil amount. The purpose of this factor is to ensure local authorities provide the minimum per pupil funding levels to primary and secondary schools. The rates for the minimum per pupil funding levels 2024 to 2025 are for primary 4,610, for secondary 5,995, that's 5,771 for Key Stage 3 and 6,331 for Key Stage 4. Specific MPPLs will be produced that differ from these for schools with non-standard year groups such as middle and all through schools. All local authorities must implement the MPPLs to every school using the same methodology used in the NFF. We have further details of this in the NFF technical note. Any capping and scaling can't take the per pupil funding below the minimum per pupil levels. The only other calculation is to deduct funding from dedelegated central services from mainstream schools with agreement from Schools Forum. Local authorities can request to supply the use of the full NFF MPPLs. Any variance in levels in particular to reduce those will need to be exceptional and on the grounds of affordability only. We have had some requests to supply the standard calculation where a school MPPL value is significantly skewed by the unusual year group sizes. For example, where LA want to provide a higher MPPL for an all through where the secondary cohort is significantly larger than the primary. Additional needs factors. These factors should all be brought 10% closer to the NFF, subject to 2.5% mirroring threshold. All these additional factors are compulsory. These factors allocate funding based on the additional needs of the specific child. The factors are deprivation factors, including free schools meals every 6, and the income deprivation affecting children index, low prior attainment, English as an additional language, and pupil mobility. Deprivation factors. Deprivation used to be one factor, and local authorities could choose whether to use them. They are now compulsory in their own right, and local authority needs to use all 3 factors. We measure eligibility for current FSM and every 6 FSM. Pupils entitled to free meals at any time in the last 6 years using the previous October census. The ADACI measure uses 6 bands and different values can be attached to each band. Different units can be used for primary and secondary within each band. The Department Levelling Up and Housing Committee published new ADACI data on the 26th of September. For schools not low prior attainment, this is a compulsory factor and values must be brought 10% closer to NFF values subject to a 2.5% mirroring threshold. Local authority must apply this factor for primary pupils identified as not achieving the expected level of development in the earliest foundation stage profile and secondary pupils not reaching the expected standard in Key Stage 2 at either reading, writing or maths. More challenging Key Stage 2 tests were introduced in the 15-16 academic year, and as such we have weighted the low prior attainment factor for some secondary year groups so that those who have sat the more challenging tests do not have a disproportionate influence within the total for the prior attainment factor in the mainstream formula. Local authorities should use a 2022 assessment as a proxy for the missing assessments in 2021 and the 2019 assessment as a proxy for the missing assessments in 2020. This is a change from last year. Schools that do not have cohorts which sat assessments in 2019 or 2022, local authorities should use the school's LPA proportion from the 2023 to 2024 APT as a proxy for the missing assessments instead. The number of pupils identified as having low prior attainment in the data will be multiplied by the relevant weighting to determine the number of pupils eligible for the factor for funding purposes. We have further details about this in the school's operational guide. English as an additional language. This is a compulsory factor and values must be brought 10% closer to the NFF values, subject to 2.5% revenue threshold. Pupils identified in the October census with the first language other than English attract funding for 3 years after they enter statutory school system. 3 years must now be used as an indicator in line with the department's methodology for the NFF. Providing funding for 1 and 2 years is no longer allowed. There are separate values for primary and secondary. Pupil mobility. This is a compulsory factor and values must be brought 10% closer to NFF values, subject to 2.5% mirroring threshold. The mobility factor allocates funding to schools with a high proportion of pupils who first joined on a non-standard date in the last 3 years. A standard date means student was first recorded in the October census for year 1s to 11. For reception pupils, this could be either the October or the January census. Therefore, where the student is first recorded in the January-May census, this would be non-typical. This excludes reception years whose typical first census could either be October or January. To be eligible for mobility funding, the proportion of mobile pupils a school has must be above the threshold of 6%. Funding is then allocated on a per pupil amount to all mobile pupils above that threshold. School-led funding. These factors include sparsity, lump sum, split sites, rates, private finance initiative, and exceptional circumstances related to premises. So the first school-led factor, sparsity. This is a compulsory factor and values must be brought 10% closer to the NFF values, subject to 2.5% mirroring threshold. In 2023 to 2024, 58 local authorities had schools that were eligible for sparsity funding. This is reduced from 65 in 2022 to 2023. We measure sparsity distance using road distances. To calculate a school sparsity distance, we take all the pupils for whom it is the nearest compatible school and find the average shortest road distance from these pupils' home postcodes to their second nearest compatible schools. The year group size statement. A school attracts sparsity funding in inverse proportion to its average year group size. The smaller the school, the greater the allocation. Different values and methodologies can be used for the primary, middle, and all through secondary phases. Local authorities can opt to apply it as a taper or as a lump sum. For the distance taper threshold, this is optional for 2024 to 2025. The distance taper threshold must be set 20% below the main thresholds, operating on a sliding scale. Further details on sparsity plus examples are set out in the school's operational guide and also in the NFF technical note. Local authorities can make an exceptional application to the department about sparsity distances after agreeing with this with the school's forum. And again, more details on this are found in the school's operational guide. Lump sum. This is a compulsory factor and values must be brought 10% closer to NFF values, subject to 2.5% mirroring threshold. In 2024 to 2025, the rolled-in lump sum element of the MSAG should be added to local formula lump sum. Local authorities can set a flat lump sum for all phases or differentiate the sums for primary and secondary. All through schools will receive the secondary lump sum value and middle schools will receive an average based on the number of primary and secondary year groups. Amalgamated schools will also attract a percentage for both or all of the lump sum. Where schools amalgamate during the financial year 2023-2024 or on the 1st of April 2023, they'll retain 85% of the predecessor lump sums for the financial year 24-25. Where schools amalgamate after the 1st of April 2024, the new school will receive funding equivalent to the funding formula of the closing schools added together for the appropriate proportion of the year. This means they'll receive the combined lump sum for the remainder of the year in which they'll amalgamate and 85% of the joint lump sum the following year. Local authorities can also apply for a second year of protection. This would require this application and again will be considered on a case-by-case basis. We've set out the full details in the school's operational guide. Split sites. This is a compulsory factor. 108 local authorities were eligible for this factor last year. The purpose of this factor is to support schools that have unavoidable extra costs because the school buildings are on separate sites. The factor is made up of two parts, both of which are compulsory. Basic eligibility funding. Schools must be allocated lump sum payment for each of their additional eligible sites, and then distance funding. Additional funding must be paid out on top of the basic eligibility lump sum for schools whose eligible sites are separated by more than 100 metres by road distance from the main site. The basic eligibility criteria for split sites funding requires additional sites to be part of the main school, that is, to share the same unique reference number with the school's main site. Be separated from the school's main site by a public road or railway. Have a building on them which is maintained by the school and which is primarily used for the education of 5 to 16-year-olds pupils in mainstream education. This includes playing fields, ancillary buildings, and buildings leased out full-time by the school to another entity. Funding for the distance element should be allocated through a tapered approach. All schools and academies that meet the criteria will be eligible for split site funding. The number of additional sites that schools can receive funding for the school should be capped at 3 per school. It's worth noting that schools sharing facilities, federated schools, and schools with remote sixth forms or remote early year provision are not eligible for split site funding. Rates. This is an optional factor. All local authorities use it. As in 2023 to 2024, rates will be paid directly by ESFA to those billing authorities adopting the central NNDR payment process on behalf of their maintained schools and academies. We currently have 166 billing authorities on the central process. This is just over half of all billing authorities. For April 2024, it will remain optional for billing authorities to implement the central payment process. In two-tier areas, all billing authorities in that county must agree to adopt the central payment process to be able to implement the changes. Billing authorities implementing the central payment process for April 2024 will submit their rates data via the online portal. Adjustments will be submitted via this service too. For local authorities whose billing authority remains under the current arrangements will not see any changes. The dedicated school grant allocation will include the NFF and NNDR amount, and this funding will be included in the school's budget as per current regulations. NNDR remains part of the school's budget share. Rates should also continue to be reflected in the Section 251 outturn statement and in each of the school's accounts. Local authorities, billing authorities not adopting the central payment process will include adjustments in the 2024 to 2025 APT. Local authorities, billing authorities adopting central payment process will only include adjustments in the 2024 to 2025 APT for the last quarter of 2023 to 2024. Where there have been re-evaluations for their maintained schools, we do not expect to see any adjustments for academies. Billing authorities will need to confirm by January 2024 which approach they will implement for rates in April 2024. We do strongly encourage all local authorities to speak to their billing authorities to move across the central system to minimise the financial strain on schools. Under the central system, ESFA pays the actual bills in real time and there's no lagging funding, so schools are not under any pressure to absorb increased NNDR costs. We will be holding webinars in late November for billing authorities to talk through the process and discuss any concerns that they may have. PFI. This is an optional factor. The purpose of this factor is to support schools that have unavoidable extra premises costs because they are a PFI school and to cover situations where the PFI affordability gap is delegated and paid back to the local authority. There's no change to the PFI factor for 2024 to 2025. Affordability models will be requested where local authorities are asking to increase the PFI factor by more than 10.4% or have not passed on the full 10.4% increase. Methodology for funding PFI schools must be objective and clear and capable of being replicated for academies. The purpose of the factor is to fund the additional costs to a school of being in a PFI contract, not necessarily the full cost, as some costs may be covered within other factors. If a PFI factor is used, all PFI schools should receive it. There may be different arrangements between contracts, but within a contract, all PFI schools should receive funding on an equivalent basis. This does not necessarily mean all schools should receive the same amount per pupil, but they should be treated consistently. The clear formula examples of funding PFI schools are allocations in accordance with the original Governor's Agreement. Allocations reflect the difference between PFI contractual costs and the grant received by the LA, less any local authority contributions. Methodologies for allocating could include percentage of the school's budget share, per pupil rate per square metre floor area, or historic lump sum previously agreed and indexed by percentage each year. If you do consider there's circumstances which may have significant impacts on an existing PFI contract, including potential grounds for termination, please do let the DFA private finance team know to discuss this in the first instance, as such matters may impact your funding. Full details and examples of methodologies are available in the school's operational guide. Exceptional circumstances, premises factor. This is an optional factor. Local authorities can apply to the SFA to use exceptional factors relating to school premises costs, for example, for rent or joint use sports facilities. Local authorities only submit applications where the value of the factor is more than 1% of a school's budget and applies to fewer than 5% of the schools in the local authority's area. If a local authority received approval between 2019 to 2020 onwards, the approved factors can still be used if the criteria is being met. If approval was received prior to this, a new disapplication request is required. Examples of exceptional costs could include rent, joint use of leisure facilities, building schools for the future schemes, hire of PE facilities, listed buildings, schools with a farm, including as part of the educational provision. All applications will be considered on their own merits, and if they fall into one of these categories or have been previously approved, it doesn't mean that they will, again, be approved. Additional schools can receive the factor due to changing circumstances, as long as the cost exceeds 1% of the budget, and the factor will still apply to less than 5% of the schools. Supporting elements must be provided, such as rental agreements and joint use agreements. Where previously approved and the criteria is still being met, the factor can continue to be used for up to 6 years before you need to reapply. When considering making requests, you should look at the circumstances of academies and free schools, as well as maintained schools. Any additional costs related to RAC should not be put through the NFF. These costs are being handled outside of this funding. If you do need to apply for this application, this must be done by the dates that we've stipulated in the operational guide. We will cover submitting these applications in detail in another workshop. The London Fringe. This factor is only applicable to Buckinghamshire, Essex, Hertfordshire, Kent, West Sussex, and is compulsory. The purpose of this factor is to support schools that have higher costs because they are in the London Fringe area and where only part of the local authority is in this area. The multiplier is added to 7 pupil-led factors, the lump sum factor, the sparsity factor, and the split sites factor. For 2024 to 2025, local authorities that use the 1.0156 multiplier in 2023 to 2024 will be required to move at least 10% closer to the ratio of the 2 area cost adjustments. Local authorities which use a ratio of the 2 area cost adjustments in 2023 to 2024 will be required to continue to do so. The 2.5% money threshold does not apply to the fringe factor. The 10% target requirement for all factors other than the fringe factor itself will be calculated in respect to the factor values for the part of the local authority which has a lower ACA value. Minimum funding guarantee. Local authorities must set the pre-16 MFG in their local formulae to protect schools from excessive year-on-year losses. Local authorities can choose to set an MFG between plus 0% and 0.5% per pupil. Local authorities will need to consult on the level of the FMG, as with the rest of the formula. Any local authority wanting to set an MFG outside of these parameters must apply for exceptional permission through the disapplication process. Funding representing funding allocated through the 2023-24 mainstream schools additional grant for reception to year-end pupils must also be included in the baseline. MSAG. The adjustment will be included in the APT when it is available to each LA. It's based on pupil numbers from the APT rather than pupil numbers underpinning the actual MSAG allocations. This ensures changes in pupil numbers do not distort the funding protected through the floor in per pupil terms. The MFG protection for special schools has changed, and this is covered in the high needs funding operational. This is covered in the high needs funding operational guide and also in a separate workshop. There are exceptional circumstances where local authorities may want to disapply the MFG if there's a significant change in school circumstances or pupil numbers. For instance, schools that previously qualified for a split site, P5 exception factor, but no longer eligible. Where the normal operation of the MFG would produce perverse results for very small schools with falling or rising roles. Secondary schools that are admitting primary age pupils who would otherwise be overprotected at the secondary age weighted pupil unit of funding. Where overprotection would otherwise occur, for example, where additional funding has been distributed in the previous year and the authority can demonstrate that the funding is generally one-off. It's worth highlighting that any application request would be specific for that year only, and the department would not expect these to be repeated. Prior approvals will not automatically be carried forward. Details of the calculations, along with examples, can be found in the school's operational guide. Capping and scaling. Local authorities can choose to cap gains schools received this year through the local formula, unlike NFF where no gains cap is applied. Capping and scaling must be applied on the same basis to all schools. Local authorities and their schools forums, as part of their formula modelling, need to determine whether and how to limit any gains. This remains a local decision. ESFA will apply caps and scales to academy budgets on the same basis as for maintained schools. Capping and scaling factors must not be applied to schools that have opened in the last 7 years and that have not reached their full number of year groups. This definition of new and growing schools does not include existing schools that are extending to include a new phase and have empty year groups in the new phase. Capping and scaling must also not take a school below the MPPLs. Where you do elect to apply a gains cap in 24-25, the cap must be at least as high as the MFG threshold to ensure all schools retains any gains up to the MFG threshold, even where a cap is applied. In helping you to set your formula for 24-25, we've published indicative allocations. We've also published the NFF tables for schools and higher needs. All allocations will be subject to change, and these changes will be confirmed in December. The Growth Fund. Growth funding is within local authority school block DSG allocations. It's calculated using the same methodology as last year based on growth in pupil numbers between the October 2022 and the October 2023 censuses. No growth protection will be offered in 2024 to 2025. As growth is within the school's block, a movement of funding from the school's formula into growth fund will not be treated as a transfer between blocks. If doing this, you would need to consult your school's forum on the total growth fund. The growth fund can only be used to support growth in pre-16 pupil numbers to meet basic need, support additional classes needed to meet infant class size regulation, and to meet the cost of new schools. The growth fund cannot be used to support schools in financial difficulty. Any such support for maintained schools should be provided from a de-delegated contingency or general growth due to popularity, which is managed through lagged funding. For the first time in 24-25, local authorities will be required to provide growth funding where a school or academy has agreed with the local authority to provide an extra class to meet basic need in the area, either as a board class or as an ongoing commitment. Funding, either through the growth fund or by adjusting pupil numbers in the APT, will need to be provided regardless of whether the additional class is within or outside of the PAN. As a minimum, local authorities will have to provide funding to a level which is compliant with the following formula. Primary growth factor value, which is 1,550, times by the number of pupils, times by the area cost adjustment. Local authorities are required to produce a criterion on which any growth funding is to be allocated, and this must be agreed by the school's forum. The criteria for allocating growth should contain clear objective figure points for qualification and a clear formula for calculating allocations with these criteria being applied to all schools on a consistent basis. Details of compliant growth fund criteria can be found in the school's operation guide, along with suitable methodologies for distributing funding, such as per pupil or VA lump sum. Any underspending growth funding should be reported to schools forum and can be carried forward to the following funding period. Any overspend will form part of the overall DSG surplus or deficit balance. As with the growth fund, the following rules fund criteria is set by the local authority. There is specific guidance around this. Local authorities may set aside schools block funding to create a small fund to support schools with falling roles. From 24-25, the restriction on this fund to only apply to schools with a good or standing Ofsted rating has been removed. Funding can only be provided where the 2022 SCAT data shows a need for school places within the subsequent 3 to 5 years. This replaces the ability to use local planning data. The schools forum should agree both the value of the fund and the criteria for allocation. The criteria for allocating falling roles funding should contain clear objective trigger points for qualification and a clear formula for calculating allocations. Differences in allocation methodology are permitted between phases. Compliant criteria would generally contain some of the following features. Surplus capacity exceeds a minimum number of pupils or a percentage of the published admission number. The minimum percentage of surplus places will be required in the next 3 to 5 years. Formula funding available to schools will not support the provision of appropriate curriculum for the existing cohort. Schools will need to make redundancies in order to contain spending within its formula budget. There are different methodologies for distributing funding. These could include rate per vacant place, up to a maximum specified number, and lump sum with clear parameters of calculation. As with growth, any surplus should be reported to schools from at the year end, and it can be carried forward to planning. It can be carried forward to the following funding period. Local authorities are required to identify an official budget for mainstream schools to help with their duties to meet the special education needs of their pupils. This is not a separate budget, and it's within a maintained school's budget share and an academy's GAG. It's calculated by local authority using local mainstream schools formula factors, and it's intended to meet the cost of sport for children with SEN needs up to £6,000 per pupil per annum. This figure is not a target or a constraint. High needs top-up funding covers costs over £6,000, and local authorities can also supplement some of their schools' national SEN budgets with targeted high needs funding. The budget calculation should be kept under review and should take into account what schools need to spend on SEN support. Separate guidance has been published to help you review your budget calculations and to help schools understand what the budget is for. This is available on the same page as the school's operational guide. Dedicated schools can mark deficits and high needs exceptional funding. The department now runs 3 programs offering direct support to ensure effectiveness and financial sustainability of local authorities' high needs systems. The Safety Valve program targets local authorities with the highest DSG deficits. Local authorities need to develop sustainable plans to rapidly become sustainable. The plans are deemed sustainable, and the local authority shows progress, and an agreement will be entered into, and the local authority will receive incremental funding for the historic deficits spread over 5 financial years. The Doing Better Value in Send program targets less severe but substantial growing deficits. There's no funding to eliminate the deficits, but it will provide more effective and financially sustainable SEND services to achieve better outcomes for pupils with SEN. The East of A support programme. All remaining local authorities will develop appropriate DSG management plans. The team will aim to meet with all LAs not included in the other programmes and will provide support and challenge through reviewing the plans for the remaining local authorities in deficit. Thank you for listening, and that concludes our presentation today.